I'm only a cook," she whispered. The rancher saw her scars and changed one rule. Marlin stepped into the ranch kitchen before sunrise and found smoke already trapped under the ceiling, 2 blackened loaves on the stove, and 3 ranch hands waiting near the table with the kind of silence that meant breakfast had already failed before anyone admitted it. The old cook had left in the night. The youngest hand was trying to scrape burnt crust from an iron pan, and someone muttered that the crew would lose half the morning if food did not reach the field in 10 minutes. Mara did not answer. She crossed straight to the stove, pulled the ruined bread aside, lifted the broth pot, and checked what remained without asking where anything was kept. The broth was thin, but still warm. A sack of flour stood open near the wall, onions half cut on the board, yesterday's fat still hardened beside the fire. She added flour first, stirred fast, dropped onions in next, then tore the least burned bread into the pan and pressed it under the broth before anyone had time to question the smell changing. One ranch hand laughed quietly and said broth could not become breakfast just because a stranger stirred it harder. Mara kept working. By the time the first spoon touched the pan edge, the smoke had changed into steam, and the room no longer smelled ruined. A chair scraped behind her. Elias Boone had entered without noise, coat still damp from the yard, watching, not the stove, but the way she measured portions before serving any bowl. Mara lifted the iron handle to move the pot, and her sleeve slipped just enough for the scar across her wrist to catch morning light. Old skin, pale and tightened, running farther than the cuff allowed. One of the ranch hands saw it too and said, "If kitchen help moves that slow, the horses eat before we do." Mara reached for the bowls anyway, but before she placed the first one down, Elias spoke. "Then you can wait longer." The room quieted because he had not raised his voice. He stepped closer, took one bowl from Mara's hand, and set it himself at the head of the table before looking once at the man who had spoken. "New rule," he said. "After dark, no one enters this kitchen unless she says so." The youngest hand frowned first. "For one cook?" Elias looked toward the stove where Mara had already divided the broth, exactly into equal portions, without spilling a spoonful. "For this kitchen," he answered. No one argued after that because he had already turned toward the door. But before leaving, he paused near the shelf, checked the flour sack with one glance, then said without touching it, "That sack was fuller yesterday. Count again before noon." Mara noticed that line more than the rule itself. He had seen the missing flour before breakfast was even served. Outside, Boots moved toward the yard at last. Bowls emptied faster than anyone admitted, and when Mara reached for the final loaf to cut away the black edge, she found Elias had left one untouched on the table beside her. Still warm, but split cleanly in half, as if he had already decided she had not eaten either. By evening, the kitchen no longer smelled of smoke, but of beans, onion, and bread, browned carefully instead of rushed. And Mara had already learned which shelf held salt, which bucket the men reached for first, and which ranch hand opened drawers without putting anything back where it belonged. She worked with the door half open because the last light still reached the stove, but once darkness crossed the floorboards, she closed it herself and slid the wooden latch into place without thinking about who might notice. Supper was nearly ready when Boots stopped outside. A knuckle struck the door once, then again, harder the second time. Mara lifted the lid from the pot, but did not answer. The latch moved anyway. Wade Turner, broad-shouldered and still dusty from the lower fence line, pushed the door open halfway before the wood caught against the bar. "Need my plate now," he said, already reaching through the gap as if rules belonged to morning only. Mara stepped closer, wiped her hands once on the apron, and looked directly at the hand still holding the door. "You wait with the others." Wade smiled as though patience were something he had outgrown years ago. Kitchen used to stay open till we finished work. Mara reached behind her, took the serving spoon from the counter, and set it down slowly where he could see she was not nervous enough to fumble. Kitchen changed this morning. He pushed again, stronger now, enough for the latch to strain. 2 other men had gathered behind him, not speaking, only watching to see whether the new rule bent by nightfall. Mara did not shout for help. She walked to the pantry shelf instead, took the small iron key, hanging from the side nail, and locked the grain cupboard before turning back. The sound of the key settling into her palm made Wade finally pause. "You locking food now?" he asked, "until the door stays closed." The answer landed harder because it came quietly. A moment later, another set of boots crossed the porch boards outside, slower than the others. Elias opened the outer screen without hurry and looked first at Wade's hand on the door, then at the latch, then at the key in Mara's fingers. No one explained. He did not ask for one. "You missed supper once," he said to Wade. "You remember rules twice." Wade let go of the door immediately, but the silence after that carried more weight than argument would have. The 2 men behind him stepped back before being told. Elias waited until all 3 had left the porch, then turned toward Mara. "Serve the others first," he said. "He eats after the horses are watered." Mara unlocked the cupboard, only after he moved aside. When she carried the first bowls to the table, minutes later, every seat was filled except Wade's. No one complained about portion size. No one reached before she set the bowls down. But Elias, seated near the window, looked once toward the shelf and said quietly enough that only she heard it, "2 onions missing since morning. Same hand that took flour doesn't stop at flour." The next evening, the meat meant for supper was not enough even before Mara cut it, and she knew that the moment she opened the wrapped cloth and saw how little remained on the board. 7 men had come back from the north pasture, hungry, Wade included, and the youngest ranch hand had already said the butcher wagon would not return before tomorrow because the river crossing had turned soft after rain. The easiest choice would have been to cook the meat thin and let half the table leave unsatisfied. But Mara did not touch the pan first. She counted bowls instead. 7 for the men, 1 for Elias, 1 for herself if anything remained. Then checked the bean jar, the onion basket, and the heel of yesterday's bread. She soaked the bread in broth before lighting the larger burner, crushed dried herbs between her fingers, and sliced the meat so thin it looked smaller with every pass of the knife. But when it hit the iron with onions and beans already hot beneath it, the smell changed fast enough that even the men outside the door fell quiet before entering. Wade sat down first this time, but said nothing, perhaps because he still remembered eating after dark the night before. Mara served the beans first, then laid the meat only across the top where every bowl looked evenly finished. No one complained when they realized there was no second pan coming. The youngest hand ate 2 spoonfuls before saying, almost unwillingly, that it tasted fuller than the portions looked. Elias did not answer immediately. He had arrived from the barn carrying a torn feed sack and had placed it near the wall before sitting down. While the others ate, he looked once at the shelf where flour should have stood level, then at the feed sack, then toward the side door. 1 oat sack short, too, he said, as if continuing a thought no one else had heard. Wade looked up first. "From the wagon." Elias shook his head. "From this morning, before the wagon." That changed the room because missing kitchen flour could be blamed on careless hands. But feed disappearing before noon meant someone was helping themselves where no one expected counting. Mara noticed he had reached that answer without touching the storage room. He had only looked at what remained, then at what should have lasted longer. After supper, she carried the bowls back while the men returned outside, and Elias remained long enough to lift the torn feed sack she had ignored earlier. Its seam had split cleanly near the bottom. Mara reached for needle and cord, without asking why he had brought it. He watched her thread the needle, then said, "You stitch like someone who learned before needing to." Mara kept her eyes on the seam. "You count like someone who notices before losing." For the first time that day, something close to approval touched his face. He left the sack on the table and stepped toward the door, but before going outside, he added, "Tomorrow the butcher wagon comes. If one sack leaves short again, I'll know which hand lifts early." Mara tied the knot, turned the sack over, and found a small slit near the base, already repaired once before by someone less careful than she was. The butcher wagon arrived just after noon, wheels heavy with mud from the south road, and before the driver had even climbed down, Elias was already standing near the loading step, with his hand resting lightly on the side rail, not impatient, only waiting with the kind of stillness that made other men speak too quickly. Mara had been hanging washcloth near the kitchen line, but stopped when she saw him glance once across the stacked sacks before a single item touched the ground. The driver began naming what had been brought: salt, cured meat, oats, flour. But Elias interrupted before the list reached halfway. "One flour short." The driver frowned and pointed toward the wagon bed, saying nothing had been unloaded yet. Elias climbed up, shifted only the top crate, and reached behind the wheel brace where one sack had slid deep enough to hide under shadow. He lifted it down without effort and set it beside the others. "That one tears if you drag it," he said, already noticing the weak seam near the corner. The driver laughed awkwardly and admitted he had not seen it there himself. Mara watched from the line, understanding now that Elias did not count after mistakes appeared. He counted before they became mistakes. Later that afternoon, the sky darkened unexpectedly again, though the morning had been clear, and wind began pressing hard against the side sheds before the first drop reached the yard. Elias crossed from the barn to the storage room in 3 long steps and started moving feed sacks off the floor before the first rain even touched the porch boards. 2 ranch hands followed because he had already chosen the right side of the room, the one where runoff always entered first. Mara carried empty crates without being asked and saw that he stacked the flour high but left salt nearest the back wall where air stayed driest. "Storm's turning east," Wade said from the doorway, surprised by how quickly the light had changed. Elias shook his head once. "It'll turn back when the ridge catches it." 10 minutes later, it did exactly that, striking the lower yard hard enough to send water under the outer fence. Mara reached to shut the kitchen window, just as one lantern hook slipped loose in the gust. The lantern tipped. Boiling water jumped from the stove edge, and she caught the handle before it fell. But the movement pulled her sleeve high enough for the deeper scars along her forearm to show fully in firelight. Older burns, layered and uneven, far beyond one accident. She set the lantern down without sound, though pain crossed her face before she hit it. Elias saw it from the doorway and stopped there, not stepping closer, not asking the obvious question first. Rain hammered the roof once, twice, hard enough to fill the silence. Mara wrapped the cloth around the handle again, before speaking. Some kitchens were not safe places. It was only one sentence, but it settled heavier than a full story would have. Elias looked at the scars once more, then at the stove, then crossed the room to lower the flame himself before the pot boiled over again. Outside, the rain thickened, and by dusk he was coughing for the first time that week, though he stayed in the yard until the last feed sack was covered. By morning the storm had passed, but Elias did not come to breakfast when the men gathered, and that alone changed the room before anyone spoke. Wade looked once toward the porch, then toward Mara, as if expecting her to explain something she had no reason to know. The youngest hand said Elias had been outside, late covering the lower shed after midnight, because the wind had shifted again, and now his horse still stood tied where he had left it. Mara placed bowls on the table, listened to the silence, then took one untouched plate aside instead of serving it with the others. When she crossed the porch, she found him near the rear room door, trying to lift the latch with one hand, while steadying himself against the frame with the other. He was upright, but only because stubbornness was doing what strength had already stopped doing. His coat was still damp at the shoulders, and the cough that came this time bent him enough that he had to wait before taking another breath. "You should be inside," Mara said. Elias answered with the kind of look men used when they intended to continue standing, simply because someone had noticed weakness. He took one step anyway, failed to hide the second cough, and gave up arguing when she opened the door first. Inside, the room held little beyond a narrow bed, a chair, and one shelf of folded shirts. Mara set the plate down untouched and returned for hot water before he could insist he needed none. The kitchen changed pace immediately after that. She shortened breakfast by one pan, gave Wade the field count herself, and sent the youngest hand to the lower trough, because Elias normally checked it before noon. No one argued. By midday, she carried broth to the room again, adding willow bark and dried leaves she had found hanging behind the stove. And this time, Elias did not pretend he would rise before evening. "Storm caught late," he said after a long silence, as though explanation still mattered. Mara placed the bowl within reach. "Storm left late, too." That answer almost drew a smile, but the cough interrupted it. Outside, work continued because she kept it moving. One hand sent to the north fence, one to wood cutting. Supper started early enough that no one waited hungry. Wade returned at dusk and stopped at the kitchen door before speaking. "Lower trough was half blocked," he said. "Would have flooded by night." Mara nodded once because Elias had already taught them without saying so. If something is noticed early, half the damage never arrives. After dark, she took fresh cloth to the rear room and found him awake, looking toward the window where rain had left streaks across the glass. "Men listened?" he asked. Mara set the cloth on the chair. "Men ate on time." That answer satisfied him more than the first. Before leaving, she turned down the lamp, but at the doorway he spoke again, voice rougher now. "Kitchen stayed locked." Mara looked back once. No one tried the latch tonight. Outside, the ranch had gone quiet, yet for the first time since arriving, she did not close the kitchen door immediately after dark. Elias was still weak the next morning, but the ranch no longer paused waiting for him, because Mara had already learned which tasks collapsed first when left unspoken. Before sunrise, she checked the flower shelf, counted bowls, sent the youngest hand to open the upper gate before the horses crowded the lower trough, and told Wade to shift the wood stack away from the wet wall before the next damp night spoiled half of it. He obeyed, without the old hesitation, not because authority had been declared again, but because the first day she spoke in order, instead of explanation. Everything finished earlier than usual. By noon, the kitchen stayed ahead of the field instead of chasing it. Supper bread rose properly, the missing onion count stopped, and even the pantry key remained hanging untouched where she left it. When the butcher wagon returned with extra salt, the driver asked where Elias wanted the sacks stacked. Wade pointed toward Mara before answering for him. "Ask the kitchen first. If she says left wall, left wall." The sentence surprised even him, but no one corrected it. Mara chose the higher shelf because the lower boards still held damp from the storm week, and by evening the driver admitted she had saved one sack from soaking when runoff crept under the door again after sunset. Later, she carried broth to Elias and found him sitting upright for the first time since the fever began. one hand resting on the blanket, the other holding the small tin cup she had left earlier. His cough had weakened, but his voice still sounded rough when he asked, "Who checked the north fence?" "Wade. Did he miss the loose hinge?" Mara set the bowl down. "He saw it because I sent him before noon." That answer held longer than either expected, because it was the first time she had answered one of his practical questions, as though the work between them now belonged to both. He took the broth, drank slowly, then looked toward the doorway where the kitchen light still reached the floorboards outside. "Men stop arguing," Mara gave a quiet nod. "They started asking where things belong before moving them." Elias leaned back slightly, more tired than he wanted to show, but the smallest trace of relief crossed his face, not because the fever was leaving, but because the ranch had continued without noise. Before she left, he asked one last thing. "Door still locked after dark?" Mara looked toward the hall where the kitchen stood open behind her, lantern light spilling farther than usual. "Tonight it stayed open." He understood at once what had changed. Not the rule itself, but the fact that she no longer needed the latch to feel the room was hers. The next morning, he came to the kitchen doorway before breakfast, still pale but standing, and found the table already set in the exact order he always preferred. Salt nearest the end seat, bread cut before the men arrived, and the feed count marked not on paper, but by sacks already separated near the back wall before anyone asked. The first full morning, Elias returned to the table. The ranch noticed before he sat down because no one had expected him upright so soon. Yet the greater surprise was that nothing in the kitchen changed when he entered. Mara did not stop stirring, did not step aside, did not wait for him to take over the room that had quietly become hers while he was ill. Breakfast was already arranged exactly as the ranch now expected it. Bread cut before the men arrived, bowls placed by work order, salt near the head seat, and the day's feed split into 2 measured stacks beside the back wall before anyone asked where the extra sack belonged. Wade came in, carrying harness straps, looked once at Elias, then toward Mara before speaking. "Upper trough needs checking before noon. Which side first?" It was the first time he asked her while Elias stood in the room, and that mattered more than the question itself. Elias took his seat slowly, still pale enough that no one missed the effort, then answered without looking up from the table. "If Mara says north side, start north." The room accepted it with no laughter because the last week had already made the answer ordinary. Mara finished pouring broth into the final bowl and handed it toward Elias before he could reach for it himself. He took it, but instead of eating first, he looked toward the pantry shelf where the key still hung untouched. "Nothing missing now," he said. Mara rested one hand on the counter. "People steal less when portions arrive before excuses do." Even Wade smiled at that before leaving for the yard. By midday the air had cleared fully, and for the first time since the storm week the ranch sounded ordinary again. Hammers at the shed, horses shifting near the trough, wind moving through dry boards instead of rain. Mara used the quiet to sort the rear shelf where old cloth and unused kitchen tools had been left untouched for years. Beneath folded blankets, she found the same tin box Elias had not spoken about again since showing it once. Seed packets tied by season, still marked in faded handwriting from another time. She closed the lid carefully and left it where it had stood. But when she turned, Elias was already in the doorway, stronger now, watching without concern that she had opened it. "Ground near the east fence takes late planting," he said, as though continuing a conversation that had started long before she arrived. Mara looked from the box to the window where sunlight reached the yard. "Then those should not stay closed another season." The answer held between them because neither pretended it was only about seeds. That evening after supper, she did something no one else noticed but him. Instead of latching the kitchen door when darkness came, she left it open and set a second plate beside his, before stepping out to call the men in. When she returned, Elias had not touched either plate yet. He was standing near the doorway, looking at the open frame, then at her. "Rule changed?" he asked quietly. Mara met his eyes without lowering hers this time. "Rules change when fear does." She sat down opposite him, and outside the ranch kept its ordinary sounds, while inside, nothing felt temporary anymore.
If one quiet rule made you feel safe for the first time in years, would you trust the person who made it, or still wait for proof? If this story stayed with you, like the video, share it, and subscribe to Echoes of a Rancher for more quiet frontier stories of love, redemption, and survival.